So I've touched on building your own board in other videos with like my tools list and stuff like that, but we're actually going to build a board today, or at least get started on it. Building your own board is probably one of the most gratifying things when it comes to setting up a board in downhill skateboarding that I've experienced. If you've experienced getting a new board and being able to show that off, it's way sicker when you actually have your own thing that you've designed yourself that, nobody else has, it's just you. So recently I noticed that Madrid, respected company in the downhill community, has recently released a build a board blank series of boards that they have. So these are basically just concave molds that have been pressed that are not cut out at all, and they actually use the same downhill molds that they use in their downhill lineup that they use here with these boards. As of now, they have 3 different molds that they have. They're all 8-ply maple with one exception. There's an 8-ply maple 42 by 10 inch board, which I believe uses the T3M mold. There is also an 8-ply with Formica, same thing, 42 by 10. And then the last one is a kicktail 40 by 10, 8-ply, no Formica. Now getting a blank like this, just a, rectangular cutout, is a really good way to start with building. The hardest part of building your own board is definitely the pressing part. There's a lot that can go wrong, from building a mold that just doesn't feel very good to messing up on the pressing and the gluing and getting things like D-lams in your system. That can be very disappointing, and it's got a kind of hard learning curve to it. So getting a board that's already been pressed is super advantageous. These Madrid blanks are pretty affordable at in between $55 to, I want to say it's $68 for the one with Formica. And this is pretty good, considering that if you want to press the board yourself, you're going to have to buy Longboard veneers at a 1/16 inch maple veneers. And if you want to get those, you either have to buy in huge bulk orders with hundreds of dollars down, or you can go with a company like Rocket, who will sell you the veneers. But even an 8-ply veneer set is going to already cost you $71, and that doesn't even include the cost of glue, which is probably going to set you back an extra $15 to $20. So these Madrid blanks are a pretty good deal as long as you are okay with the molds that they have. So which one did I got? I ended up with the 8-ply 40 by 10 kicktail version that we're going to go ahead and design. Now, I actually asked Madrid what exactly the concave mold was, and it's the T3M, which is, I think it's the most common mold that they have in their downhill lineup currently. And after doing some measurements, it's at 10-inch width, which I'm going to talk about this later. The concaves change as you change widths, but at 10 inches wide, if you were to just cut it at that width, it's a 1/2 inch of concave, which is pretty mellow compared to a lot of molds today. It either is a elliptical or tub concave, which basically just means that there is a flat section in the middle of the board, and then the concave rises up from there. So we have this flat area here, and then as it goes out to the edge, it changes. Now, tub means that it changes at the exact same rate the whole way up. It's just kind of like flat, then it angles up. Elliptical is going to be more of a gradual incline, so it goes from flat to more of an upward swoop that happens gradually. The kicktail on this mold is a flat kicktail, meaning that it changes angle kind of like tub, where it just goes from flat to a straight upward angle, right? So there's other boards that are going to have more of a scoop, like a Daisy, or I want to say the Byron does this too for Pal Peralta. Now, looking at this kicktail, most longboards you're going to want a little bit more of a mellow kicktail, and honestly, I feel like this one's kind of steep. I can't really know until I actually skate the board, but that might be a complaint that I do have later down the road. Maybe I can do that in an later video, but it does look kind of steep. This will be nice for kind of locking in if you want to do like blunt slides and things like that, but it might be a little too steep to get a really nice crispy ollie out of it. So in this part of the build, I want to talk about shaping a board. Now, a lot of times when people start their first chops of a board they already have, or maybe they're starting with chopping a blank like this one, a lot of times I see super common mistakes happening. So hopefully this video will clear up any types of chop shaping questions you might have. The first thing that you need to consider when you're doing a chop is how much function you want out of the shape and how much form you want out of the shape. There's a lot of little design quirks that you can give that make it look really cool, but maybe decrease the durability, or like in the case of having like a kicktail, certain kicktail shapes are going to be a little bit more effective than others. Another thing you want to consider is whether you want the board to have more rounded lines altogether, or if you want them to be more straightened out and geometric. You can also have a mix of those two different ones, but it's always something you want to consider. So let's go through the steps of designing the board itself, the actual drawing of the shape. The first thing that you need to do 100% is draw out your center line. The center line is so important. And one thing that's kind of cool about this Madrid setup, it's just kind of an extra thing that's nice. It's not necessary, but it is nice that they did it, is, I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera, but they put these little tiny divots in at two spots, one towards the back of the board and one towards the front of the board. And these little spots are telling us where that center point is. You want to then draw a line all the way through from end to end, marking that center line, because everything else that you draw on the board is going to be based off of that center line to make sure that you have a symmetrical shape. Unless you're max caps, then you can just do whatever asymmetrical shape you want. The next thing that I always do that you might want to do too is to mark a grid pattern out at the front and back of the board, to mark out those areas where you're going to have a lot of fine line detailing versus the other areas. You can see that marking here on the kicktail of the board, as I've done here. When it comes to actually designing the board, the first thing that I do is I design the wheelbase. If you're designing a board with a kicktail, it's pretty important that you choose the right spot for the kicktail. I usually go around 0.75 inches from where the kicktail actually starts. Now I've marked here where the kicktail starts on the line here, and so I just kind of put back the wheelbase a little bit from there. And I'm basically going to stick with just that wheelbase in that area. This is important because the geometry of how the board kicks up and how the tail actually hits the ground is going to be drastically affected based on where your wheelbase actually is. When I put the front truck wheelbase in, I literally just stood on the board and kind of just moved my hand around and felt what felt good. And this is just kind of how I would design a board. You might want to be a little bit more exact with your numbers, but I'm kind of basing it off of feel. The next thing that I do is I mark out my width. Now, to be honest, the width that I chose for this board and the width that I choose regularly is just basically based off of what trucks I'm going to put on it and probably the most likely wheels that I'm going to put on it, even though I'm probably going to use a variety of different wheels. So I knew I was going to probably put it together with some Paris 43 165s, so I just kind of set it up on there, and then I'll probably have wheels something like this, like a blood orange 70 or 65 mil, like the Liam Morgan model. So I just kind of lined it up there and saw what the width was, and it came out to about 9 1/4. The next thing you want to decide is how you feel about taper. Now, tapering is when the board changes widths throughout its course of its length. I personally like taper. I don't really like the look of a board that has straight rails on it. I know a lot of people feel very passionately the other way on that too. It's up to you. Whatever you want to do as far as the taper or no taper goes is fine. If you do want to go with some taper in your board, the next thing you need to decide is whether you want it to have front taper or rear taper. A slightly wider at the back end or slightly wider at the front end. I personally think that both actually have their own place and both look kind of good. The last board I did had a more tapered front than the rear, so I just decided to flip it. So as far as where that taper starts, I believe in the law of thirds. So you either have taper start at the front third point or the back third point of the board. All I did was measured out the overall length of the general shape at this point, came out to about 36, so I ended up with a third point of 12 inches from the front, which I marked right about here. Now, how wide was this? I said that I wanted it to be 9 1/4, but this is not the point that is 9 1/4. The spot that 9 1/4 actually happens is at the truck mounts, the inner bolts. So I have a 9 1/4 mark from here to here, as well as a 9 1/4 mark from here to here. This area, I didn't want to see too much taper, so I only have 9.5 at its widest point at the front third point of the board. Now, it's worth noting that with drastically affects the overall feel of the board. Remember I said earlier that the tub or elliptical concave in this mold is 0.5 inches, half an inch. Well, as the board gets thinner, there's going to be less and less concaves. All right, cool. So let's talk about shaping the tail. So when it comes to the tail of the board, you again have to ask yourself, like I did at the beginning, how much form versus function do you want out of the board? Now, personally, this has got a pretty fat kicktail, and I wanted to see a lot of kicktail on the board, so function is pretty important when it comes to actually how the board feels when you use it, as well as its durability. If it's got a tail, that means it's going up in the air, which means it's probably going to come down every once in a while on the rails, on the tail, on the nose. So that has to factor into how I designed the board. You don't want a lot of sharp points on the board if it's going to be hitting the ground, because that's just going to lead to it splintering and delaminating, and just it's going to have a short lifespan. When doing a kicktail, you have to kind of decide what you want the overall end shape to be. Now you have three options. You could do a total flat tail, you could do a rounded tail more so, or you could do a pointed tail. So let's talk about all three. A flat tail is going to result in the board staying very centered whenever you ollie it. So if you just want to do ollies that kind of travel in an upward straight manner, a flat tail is probably going to be what you're going to want to do, which, as you can see, is kind of what I decided on. I don't know if I'm super stuck on this. It's actually a little too flat for me, I think. I'm probably going to round it off a little bit at the edges here. So you'll see a full product on the next video. Next is going to be a more rounded tail. Now, a modern street skateboard is well known for its very rounded ends, and that's because a lot of times in street skateboarding, people are trying to rotate the board, doing tray flips, doing kick flips, doing heel flips, etc. Doing flip tricks is going to be more beneficial to have rounded kicktails. The last type of tail you can do is a more pointed tail. Now, personally, I don't really like a pointed tail because it has very little function, at least in the kicktail world. Think about it this way. Whenever you pop up the board, especially if it's a fresh board, that point is going to want to rotate the board in one of those two directions. Which direction? It's hard to know because that point at the end is so acute, it's very hard to predict which direction it's going to go. So careful when you're doing a pointed tail that you don't really want that much function out of it because it's not very functional. The last part of the shaping process comes down to the nose. Now the nose is a lot of times when you can get your most creative because most people don't do any tricks off of the nose of their board in downhill. So you can focus a little bit more on the form side versus all function, like in the case of the kicktail that I have. Now you have four options when it comes to shaping a nose. You can go with the classic pointed nose, coming down to a sharp point. You can come down to an almost flattened, blunted edge, which does technically have a point, but it's a much less sharp point. It's going to be much more blunted. And the last option is a more rounded nose, which doesn't actually have any point whatsoever. There is a fourth option, doesn't really show up too often, and that's kind of like the other category. Think like your Christian Hosoi style board. Also, I am kind of leaving out the cutout style board shapes like the Pal Peralta Samurai or like the Rain Kill Switch. Those are kind of in their own category when it comes to board shaping, and I'm not really doing that here. So yeah. So for this board, when I was deciding what I wanted to do, I kind of wanted to try going with like one of these other style noses, and it just didn't end up working out. If you actually look at the nose of the board, you can see that I have so many designs that I tried to go with, and I just couldn't really figure out how to make any of them work. What I really wanted to do is kind of this swooping Christian Hosoi style nose, but it was not looking good, and I was getting frustrated. So I just decided to go with a more blunted nose. It does have a point, but it is extremely mellow when it comes to that. And this is going to be helpful for the board shape and its function as well, because a blunted nose or rounded nose is going to take an impact the best. So if I'm taking this board off of a kicker or something like that, and it happens to nosedive on itself, it's less likely to splinter in that case. It's kind of boring to look at, in all honesty, but it is very functional. And so as you guys can see, once I was done with my shape, I went ahead and drew across the final shape with a Sharpie. This is going to be really helpful in the sanding process when Sandpaper is going to basically immediately erase any pencil markings, and it'll just be a little easier to see the Sharpie line when I'm trying to cut out the rough cut of the shape in the next step. Last thing I have to say about coming up with your own shape is to take your time. If you're not totally sure about the shape, don't just chop it out that night. Just wait until the next day, take a look at it, stand on it, decide if you like really what it looks like, and then go ahead and chop it if you do like it. Take your time. We'll start the chopping process in the next video.